The rope bit into Willa Thompson's wrists as the crowd gathered around the whipping post in the dusty main street of Redemption, Wyoming territory. The year was 1878, and speaking one's mind was not something a woman was permitted to do, especially not against the most powerful man in the county. "Let this be a lesson," Sheriff Holcomb announced, pacing before the assembled townsfolk, his badge glinting in the harsh midday sun. "No woman speaks against Judge Preston or his rulings in my town." Willa stood straight-backed despite her bound hands, her amber eyes defiant even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She had known the risk when she stood up in the packed courtroom yesterday, challenging the judge's ruling that had stripped the widowed Mrs. Miller of her ranch in favor of the mining company. But she couldn't have remained silent, not when justice was being so blatantly perverted. A deputy stepped forward with a whip, its leather tail snaking across the dirt. The crowd murmured, some looking away in shame, others leaning in with morbid fascination. Women clutched their children close, a few openly weeping, while the men shuffled uncomfortably. 20 lashes for contempt of court, the sheriff declared, and disturbing the peace. Willa closed her eyes, her breath coming in quick gasps. She would not scream, she would not give them the satisfaction. Her mother hadn't raised her to bend to injustice, even if it meant bearing the consequences alone. The deputy raised the whip, and Willa braced herself for the first biting lash. "Her voice is my freedom." The words rang out, clear and commanding across the square. The crowd parted as a tall man strode forward, his worn leather boots kicking up dust with each deliberate step. The stranger's face was partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but Willa could see the hard set of his jaw beneath several days' growth of beard. "And who might you be, mister?" Sheriff Holcomb's hand drifted toward the gun at his hip. The stranger pushed back his hat, revealing piercing blue eyes that fixed on the sheriff with the unwavering gaze of a man who had stared down death more than once. "Blake Lawson," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "And I'm telling you now that if that whip touches the lady's skin, it'll be the last thing you do as sheriff." The air itself seemed to still as Blake Lawson's words hung over the dusty street of Redemption. Sheriff Holcomb's face flushed red beneath his mustache, his fingers now fully wrapped around the grip of his pistol. "You threatening an officer of the law, stranger," he growled, taking a step forward. Blake didn't move, standing like a mountain in the middle of the street. "Not a threat. Just telling you how things are going to be." Willa twisted at her bonds, trying to see the man who had spoken up for her. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, a current of recognition, though they'd never met before. "This woman broke the law," Holcomb insisted, gesturing toward Willa. "Judge Preston's authority. Judge Preston is a thief in a black robe," Blake cut in, his voice carrying to every ear in the square. "And everyone here knows it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Willa saw faces nodding in agreement, though fear kept them from speaking out. "I've got witnesses who will testify to Preston taking bribes from Silverado Mining," Blake continued, slowly moving closer to the whipping post. "Federal marshals are on their way from Cheyenne. Be a shame if they arrive to find you'd whipped an innocent woman for speaking the truth." Sheriff Holcomb's eyes darted nervously around the crowd, sensing the shift in mood. The deputy with the whip took an uncertain step backward. "You've got no authority here," Holcomb tried again, but his voice had lost its edge. "Maybe not," Blake agreed, now standing just a few feet from Willa. "But I've got this." He pulled back his coat to reveal a U.S. Marshal's badge pinned to his vest. The crowd gasped collectively. Sheriff Holcomb's face drained of color. "Special Deputy Marshal Blake Lawson," he clarified, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. "Now, I suggest you cut that woman loose before I arrest you for attempted assault." For a moment, the scene froze in tableau, Blake standing firm, the sheriff wavering, and Willa still bound to the post. Then, with a curse, Holcomb nodded to his deputy. "Cut her loose," he ordered through gritted teeth. The deputy hurried forward with a knife, sawing through the ropes binding Willa's wrists. As the bonds fell away, she nearly collapsed, her legs weak with relief. Blake was there in an instant, a strong arm steadying her, "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Don't thank me yet," he murmured, his eyes scanning the dispersing crowd. "We've stirred up a hornet's nest, Miss Thompson, Willa Thompson," his mouth curved in a slight smile. "Well, Miss Thompson, I suggest we get somewhere safe. The sheriff and Judge Preston aren't going to take this lightly." As if summoned by his name, a portly man in a black suit pushed through the crowd, his face mottled with rage. Judge Preston pointed a trembling finger at Blake. "Arrest this man for interfering with justice." He bellowed at Sheriff Holcomb. Blake's arm tightened around Willa's waist. "Time to go," he said quietly. Before anyone could move to stop them, Blake led Willa swiftly toward a chestnut stallion tethered to a hitching post outside the saloon. In one fluid motion, he helped her up, then swung into the saddle behind her. "Hold tight," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. The horse sprang forward as shouts erupted behind them. Willa clutched the saddle horn, feeling Blake's solid presence at her back as they galloped down the main street of Redemption, dust billowing in their wake. "Where are we going?" she called over her shoulder. "Somewhere they won't find us easily," he replied, guiding the horse onto a narrow trail that led toward the foothills. "I know a place." As they rode away from town, Willa felt something unfamiliar blossoming in her chest, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had no idea who this man truly was or what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Her life had irrevocably changed the moment Blake Lawson had declared her voice his freedom. The chestnut stallion's hooves thundered across the open plain as Blake guided them away from Redemption. Willa clung to the saddle, acutely aware of the stranger's strong arm around her waist, holding her steady. The wind whipped at her hair, loosening it from its pins until it streamed behind them like a copper banner. "They'll follow us," she said, raising her voice to be heard above the pounding hooves. "Let them try," Blake replied, his tone unconcerned as he urged the horse faster. They rode for what seemed like hours, the landscape changing from open prairie to rocky foothills. Blake guided the horse with confidence, taking winding paths and crossing streams to obscure their trail. Gradually, the terrain grew more rugged, with stands of ponderosa pine providing welcome shade from the relentless afternoon sun. Finally, as the light began to fade, Blake slowed the horse to a walk, guiding it up a nearly invisible path that twisted between boulders and scrub oak. "Almost there," he said, his voice close to Willa's ear. They emerged into a small, sheltered valley hidden from view by surrounding ridges. A crude cabin nestled against the hillside with a small corral and lean-to beside it. "What is this place?" Willa asked as Blake helped her down from the horse. "Old Trapper's cabin, found it abandoned a few years back, fixed it up as a contingency." He began unsaddling the horse, his movements efficient and practiced. "No one knows about it except me." Willa rubbed her chafed wrists, taking in her surroundings. The isolation of the place struck her suddenly. She was miles from civilization with a man she'd known for less than a day. A man who had saved her from public humiliation and possibly worse, but a stranger nonetheless. "You're wondering if you've made a mistake," Blake said, reading her expression. "Wondering if you've traded one danger for another." Willa straightened her spine. "Can you blame me?" "I don't know you, Mr. Lawson," he nodded, leading the horse into the small corral. "Fair enough. But I meant what I said about the federal marshals. They'll be in Redemption within 2 days. Judge Preston and his corrupt friends have been preying on this territory long enough." "And you're truly a marshal?" Willa followed him to the cabin door. Blake pulled out a key from his vest pocket. "Special deputy, recruited specifically for this investigation." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Ladies first." Willa hesitated, then stepped inside. The cabin was small but surprisingly well kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs positioned nearby. A narrow bed stood against the opposite wall, and shelves held canned goods and supplies. "It's not much," Blake said, moving past her to light a lamp, "but it's secure." "How long will we need to stay here?" Willa asked, still standing near the door. Blake struck a match, the flare of light briefly illuminating his face. In that moment, Willa caught a glimpse of weariness behind his confident demeanor. Just until the marshals arrive and I can get you safely back to town. The lamp cast a warm glow throughout the cabin. Or would you prefer I take you somewhere else? Do you have family nearby? Willa shook her head. No family, not anymore. I teach at the school in Redemption. The school teacher. Blake smiled slightly. That explains a lot. What does that mean, your vocabulary, the way you stood up to Preston? He gestured to the table. Sit, you must be exhausted. Willa realized suddenly that she was indeed tired, her body aching from the tension and the long ride. She sank into one of the chairs as Blake moved around the small space, gathering items from the shelves. I'm sorry I don't have anything fresh, he said, setting down some canned beans and dried beef. This will have to do for tonight. It's fine, she assured him. I'm more interested in hearing about these marshals and the investigation into Judge Preston. Blake paused, studying her for a moment. Most women would be more concerned about their reputation after riding off alone with a man. Willa lifted her chin. My reputation was already in tatters the moment I spoke out in that courtroom, and I'm more concerned with justice than gossip. A genuine smile spread across Blake's face, transforming his rugged features. I believe you are, Miss Thompson, he said about preparing their simple meal. The investigation has been ongoing for nearly a year. Preston and Sheriff Holcomb have been taking bribes from mining interests, railroad men, and cattle barons, anyone who wants land that doesn't rightfully belong to them. Like Mrs. Miller's ranch, Willa said quietly. Exactly, Blake nodded. Silverado Mining discovered silver on her property, and suddenly the judge invalidates her deed on a technicality. That's why I spoke up, Willa explained, the memory of her outrage still fresh. Mrs. Miller's husband died in the war. She's been working that land alone for 15 years. And Preston just took it away with a wave of his hand. Blake set a plate before her. Your speaking out actually helped our case, drew attention to Preston's corruption in a way my investigation couldn't. Is that why you stepped in, for your case? Their eyes met across the table and something shifted in Blake's expression. No, he said quietly, that's not why. The air between them seemed to thicken. Willa found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze. Then why? She whispered. Blake seemed about to answer when a sound outside made them both freeze, the distant but unmistakable whinny of a horse. In an instant, Blake extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. Willa felt his hand close around her wrist. Don't move, he breathed, barely audible. Someone's found us. Heart pounding, Willa remained perfectly still as Blake moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. The cabin was dark enough that anyone outside wouldn't be able to see them, but the tension was palpable. After several agonizing minutes, Blake's shoulders relaxed slightly. Just a wild horse, he said quietly, but we should keep the light out just in case. Never know who might be watching these hills. Willa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Do you think Sheriff Holcomb would really come after us? Holcomb, maybe not, but Preston has hired guns at his disposal. Blake moved away from the window, his silhouette barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the shutters. Men who don't ask questions when they're paid to make problems disappear. A chill ran down Willa's spine at the matter-of-fact way he said it. And what about you, Mr. Lawson? What kind of man are you? There was a long pause before he answered. The kind who's seen enough injustice to last several lifetimes. That doesn't really answer my question. Blake struck another match, lighting a single candle, this time just enough light to see each other's faces without being visible from outside. The flickering glow cast shadows across his features as he sat across from her at the table. I fought for the Union, he said finally. Saw things no man should see. After the war, I drifted, tried ranching, mining, even ran supplies for a while. Then I witnessed a corrupt judge in Colorado sentence an innocent man to hang because some railroad baron wanted his land. His jaw tightened. I couldn't stop it. But a federal marshal who was investigating took notice of how I tracked down evidence, offered me a position. And you've been doing this ever since? Willa asked softly. Blake nodded. 5 years now. moving from town to town, rooting out the men who think their money or position puts them above the law. It must be a lonely life. Something flickered in his eyes, a vulnerability quickly masked. It has its moments. He pushed a plate toward her. You should eat. They ate in companionable silence, the simple meal satisfying after the day's events. Willa found herself studying Blake surreptitiously, the way his hands moved, confident and capable. The lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. The watchful alertness that never seemed to leave him even in this moment of relative safety. As they finished eating, an awkward realization descended upon them both. The cabin had only one bed. Blake cleared his throat. I'll sleep by the fire, he said, gesturing to the hearth. You take the bed. I couldn't, please, he interrupted gently. After what you've been through today, you need proper rest. Willa wanted to argue, but found herself too exhausted to put up much resistance. Thank you, she said instead. Blake busied himself making a pallet near the fireplace while Willa sat awkwardly, unsure of how to proceed with the practicalities of preparing for sleep in such close quarters with a man she barely knew. Sensing her discomfort, Blake gathered up his hat and gunbelt. I'll check on the horse, he said. Give you a few minutes of privacy. After he stepped outside, Willa quickly removed her outer garments, leaving on her chemise and petticoat before sliding beneath the rough blanket on the bed. The mattress was stuffed with pine needles and surprisingly comfortable. She could hear Blake moving around outside, speaking softly to the horse. When he re-entered, he had removed his vest and boots, though he remained otherwise fully clothed. He carefully added wood to the fire, building it up to ward off the night chill. Blake, Willa said softly, surprising herself with the use of his first name. He looked up, the firelight playing across his features. Yes, thank you for what you did today. No one's ever. She paused, trying to find the right words. No one's ever stood up for me like that before. Blake studied her for a long moment. Get some rest, Willa, he said finally, his voice gentle. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As Willa drifted towards sleep, she found herself wondering about this complex man who had risked himself to save a stranger. His last words before she succumbed to exhaustion echoed in her mind. Her voice is my freedom. What had he meant by that? Dawn broke over the hidden valley, sending fingers of golden light through the cabin's shuttered windows. Willa awakened slowly, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar surroundings. She blinked, memories of the previous day rushing back, the whipping post, Blake's intervention, their desperate flight from redemption. She sat up, looking toward the fireplace. Blake was gone, his makeshift bed already neatly rolled and stowed. A moment of panic seized her. Had he abandoned her here? But then she heard movement outside the cabin. Quickly, she dressed in yesterday's clothes, smoothing her hair as best she could without a proper brush. When she stepped outside, the crisp morning air filled her lungs. Blake stood by the corral, brushing down his chestnut stallion. He had already built a small fire outside where a coffee pot bubbled invitingly. He looked up at her approach, his face freshly washed, hair damp. Morning, he said simply. Sleep well. Better than I expected, Willa admitted, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. How long have you been up? Couple hours. Scouted the area to make sure we weren't followed. He gestured toward the fire. Coffee's ready. Not as good as what you're probably used to, but it's hot. Willa gratefully accepted the tin cup he offered. The coffee was indeed strong and bitter, but she welcomed the warmth and the jolt of energy it provided. She watched as Blake continued grooming the horse with practiced, efficient movements. He's beautiful, she commented, approaching the corral fence. Samson, Blake said, patting the horse's flank. Been with me 3 years now, best partner I've had. You trust him more than people. Willa asked, sipping her coffee. A brief smile touched Blake's lips. Horses don't lie, don't betray you for profit. Some people are trustworthy, she pointed out. Blake paused, looking at her over the horse's back. Fewer than you'd think, in my experience. His tone wasn't bitter, just matter of fact. That's a sad way to live. Maybe, he shrugged, but it keeps me alive. Willa studied him in the morning light. Without the urgency of yesterday's escape, she could properly take in his appearance tall and lean but powerfully built, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, she noticed, changed with the light, sometimes steel blue, sometimes with hints of gray. "What?" Blake asked, noticing her scrutiny. Willa felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm just trying to understand you, Mr. Lawson." "Back to Mr. Lawson now?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. I wasn't sure if Blake was appropriate," she admitted. He finished with the horse and approached the fire, pouring himself more coffee. "I think after yesterday we can dispense with formalities." He sat on a log near the fire, stretching his long legs before him. "Tell me about yourself, Willa Thompson. What brought you to a place like Redemption?" "The school," she answered simply. "I answered an advertisement 2 years ago. They needed a teacher and I needed." She hesitated. "A fresh start," Blake supplied. Willa nodded. "My parents died of influenza in '75. I had been teaching in a small school outside of Denver, but afterward I couldn't stay. Too many memories." "No husband suitors?" Blake asked, then quickly added, "Forgive me if that's too personal." "No, it's fine." Willa sat on another log across from him. "I was engaged once before the fever took my parents. Matthew was a banker's son. When I insisted on continuing to teach after marriage, he reconsidered." Blake raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you were lucky to be rid of him." A small laugh escaped her. "That's what my father said." She gazed into the fire. "He always encouraged my independence, said I had a mind meant for more than just keeping house." She looked up at Blake. "Not a popular view in most circles. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." Willa's voice softened with memory. "After he and Mother died, I realized I didn't want to be confined by someone else's expectations. Teaching gives me purpose, independence." "And yet you chose a frontier town like Redemption," Blake observed. "The frontier needs education more than anywhere," Willa replied. "Those children, many of them, have never owned a book of their own. Some have never seen a map of the world beyond Wyoming territory." Her expression grew animated as she spoke. "Watching them discover knowledge, seeing their minds expand, there's nothing like it." Blake watched her intently, something like admiration in his gaze. "No wonder you couldn't stay silent when you saw injustice," he said quietly. "You've been fighting it in your own way all along." Their eyes met across the fire, and Willa felt a strange flutter in her chest. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken understanding. Then Blake stood abruptly. "We should move," he said, his tone shifting back to businesslike efficiency. "I need to get closer to town, find out if the Marshals have arrived. You're going back to Redemption?" Willa asked, alarmed. "Not directly. I know a spot overlooking the valley where we can watch the main road." He began gathering their few belongings. "If the Marshals arrived on schedule, they should be there by midday." "And if they're not?" Blake's expression turned grim. "Then we need to know that too." Within half an hour, they had erased all signs of their presence and were once again astride Sampson, making their way carefully down a steep trail that wound through the pine forest. Blake rode behind Willa, one arm securely around her waist, the other holding the reins. The proximity was both comforting and unsettling. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back, the warmth of him in the cool morning air. They traveled in silence for the most part, Blake occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. By mid-morning, they had reached a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, Willa could make out the cluster of buildings that formed Redemption and the main road leading into town from the east. Blake dismounted and helped Willa down, then led Sampson to a sheltered spot where the horse wouldn't be visible from below. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a brass spyglass, extending it to its full length. "Now we wait," he said, settling behind a large boulder and training the spyglass on the road. Willa sat beside him, conscious of the silence surrounding them, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustling of pine needles in the breeze. Despite the tension of their situation, she found herself appreciating the wild beauty of the landscape. "It's peaceful up here," she remarked softly. Blake lowered the spyglass, glancing at her. "It is." Sometimes I think I'd be better suited to a life in the wilderness, away from people's schemes and greed. You'd get lonely, Willa said with certainty, his mouth quirked. What makes you so sure? Because you care too much. She met his questioning look steadily. Men who don't care about others don't risk themselves to save schoolteachers they've never met. Blake's expression softened, vulnerability briefly visible before his customary guardedness returned. Maybe I just can't abide injustice. Maybe, Willa conceded, but I think there's more to it than that. Blake was saved from responding when something caught his attention on the road below. He raised the spyglass again, his body tensing. What is it? Willa asked, leaning forward to peer into the valley. Riders coming from the east, he said, his voice tight with concentration. 4 of them might be our marshals. Willa held her breath as Blake continued to watch through the spyglass. After several minutes, he lowered it slowly, a smile spreading across his face. It's them, he confirmed. Marshal Winters and his deputies, right on time. Relief washed over Willa. So it's over, we can go back. Blake's smile faded slightly. Not quite that simple. We need to make contact with Winters first, make sure Preston and Holcomb are secured before you show your face in town again. How do we do that? There's a way down to the road about a mile ahead of where they're riding, Blake explained, already gathering their things. If we hurry, we can intercept them before they reach town. They mounted Sampson again and set off at a brisk pace, following a narrow game trail that zigzagged down the hillside. Willa clung tightly to the saddle as the horse picked his way carefully among rocks and fallen trees. Blake guided them with confidence, one arm still secure around her waist. As they neared the bottom of the slope, Blake suddenly reined in sharply, causing Sampson to halt. Willa felt him tense behind her. What, she began, but he quickly placed a hand over her mouth, silencing her. Don't move, he whispered directly into her ear. Riders coming, not the marshals. Through the trees, Willa caught glimpses of movement on the trail ahead. Blake carefully backed Sampson deeper into the cover of the pines, his body coiled with tension. They waited in absolute stillness as 3 riders passed by on the trail below, headed up into the hills the direction they had just come from. Willa's heart pounded as she recognized Sheriff Holcomb among them, his distinctive mustache visible even from a distance. The other 2 were rough-looking men she didn't recognize, heavily armed and scanning the hillside as they rode. Looking for us, Blake breathed, his lips so close to her ear that she could feel their movement. They remained frozen until the riders had passed well beyond hearing range. Only then did Blake relax slightly, guiding Sampson even deeper into the forest, away from the trail. Change of plan, he said grimly. Holcomb must have spotted the marshals and is trying to find us before we can connect with them. What do we do now? Willa asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Blake was silent for a moment, clearly thinking through their options. We circle around, approach the road from a different direction, but we need to move fast. Those marshals are riding into a potential ambush if Preston's men are waiting in town. He urged Sampson into a canter, following a barely visible path through the trees. Willa held on tightly, ducking beneath low-hanging branches as they wound their way through the forest. Despite the danger, she found herself trusting Blake's judgment implicitly. Something about his calm confidence in the face of threat steadied her own nerves. They emerged from the trees onto a rocky slope that offered a clear view of the road below. In the distance, Willa could see the 4 riders Blake had identified as marshals, still making their way steadily toward redemption. There they are, she said, pointing. Blake nodded, and we need to reach them before they hit town. He clicked to Sampson, urging him into a faster pace down the slope. As they reached level ground, Blake spurred the horse into a gallop, racing parallel to the road but staying within the cover of the tree line. Willa's heart pounded in rhythm with Sampson's hooves as they flew across the landscape, closing the distance to the marshals with every stride. Finally, Blake guided them out onto the road, directly in the path of the oncoming riders. The marshals reined in sharply, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Marshal Winters, Blake called out, raising one hand to show he meant no harm. The lead rider, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard, narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Who's asking?" "Special Deputy Blake Lawson," Blake replied, pulling out his badge with his free hand. "And this is Willa Thompson, a witness to Judge Preston's corruption." Marshal Winters studied them for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Lawson, was wondering when you'd show yourself." His gaze shifted to Willa. "Madam, heard there was some trouble in town yesterday." "That's putting it mildly," Blake said, "and there's more headed your way. Sheriff Holcomb and 2 gunmen are in the hills, likely planning to ambush you before you can arrest Preston." Winters exchanged looks with his deputies. "Figured it wouldn't be simple. What's your assessment of the situation in town?" "Preston has at least 4 hired guns besides Holcomb and his deputies," Blake reported. "The town itself is divided. Some support Preston because he lines their pockets, others are too afraid to stand against him." "And you, Miss Thompson," Winters addressed Willa directly, "where do you stand in all this?" Willa straightened her spine, meeting the Marshal's penetrating gaze. "I stand for justice, Marshal. Judge Preston has been abusing his power for years, taking land from honest people to benefit mining companies and cattle barons. I witnessed him invalidate a widow's deed just yesterday with no legal grounds whatsoever." "She spoke out in court," Blake added. "They were going to whip her for it when I intervened." Winters' expression darkened. "Whipping citizens for speaking in court, that alone is enough to remove him from the bench." He turned to his deputies. "Clancy, Taylor, circle back and see if you can locate Holcomb and his men. Hendricks, you're with me and the witnesses." As the 2 deputies peeled off, Winters gestured for Blake and Willa to fall in alongside him. "We'll take the direct approach," he said grimly. "Head straight into town. Preston won't expect that, especially with Holcomb out searching for you." "It's risky," Blake pointed out. "Sometimes the boldest move is the safest," Winters replied. "Besides, I've got federal warrants for Preston, Holcomb, and 3 mining executives, all perfectly legal and proper. Let's see him try to weasel out of that in front of the whole town." As they rode toward redemption, Willa found herself watching Blake's profile, the determined set of his jaw, the alertness in his eyes as he scanned their surroundings. This man had risked everything for a principle, for justice, for her. The realization settled deep within her, a warmth that countered the chill of fear. Whatever happened next, she knew with absolute certainty that meeting Blake Lawson had changed her life forever. Whether that change would lead to joy or heartbreak remained to be seen, but Willa Thompson had never been one to shy away from the unknown. The sun hung high in the sky as they approached redemption, the town appearing deceptively peaceful in the midday light. Dust motes danced in the air as they rode down the main street, townspeople stopping to stare at the unusual procession. Willa felt their eyes on her, heard the whispers start the schoolteacher who had dared to speak against Judge Preston, now returning with federal marshals. Blake rode close beside her, his presence reassuring. "Head high," he murmured. "You've done nothing wrong." Marshal Winters led them directly to the courthouse, a 2-story building that also housed Judge Preston's chambers. As they dismounted, a small crowd began to gather, curiosity overcoming caution. "Might be best if you wait out here, Miss Thompson," Winters suggested, handing his reins to Deputy Hendricks. "No," Willa said firmly. "I want to see this through." Blake gave her a quick, approving nod before following Winters up the steps and into the courthouse. Inside, the building was cool and dim after the bright sunlight. The main courtroom stood empty, the previous day's proceedings apparently concluded. A clerk looked up from his desk, his eyes widening at the sight of the marshal's badge. "Judge Preston," Winters said, his tone making it clear this was a demand, not a question. The clerk swallowed nervously. "In his chambers, sir. Shall I announce you?" "We'll announce ourselves," Winters replied, striding past the desk toward a door marked Judge's Chambers. Without knocking, he pushed the door open. Judge Preston sat behind an imposing oak desk, a glass of whiskey in one hand despite the early hour. His florid face registered first surprise, then alarm at the sight of Marshal Winters. When his gaze fell on Willa standing between Blake and Deputy Hendricks, his expression contorted with rage. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he blustered, rising to his feet. Marshal Winters stepped forward, unfolding an official-looking document. "Thurston Preston, I have here a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of corruption, bribery, abuse of power, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." Preston's face drained of color, but he quickly recovered. "This is absurd. I am a duly appointed judge of the territorial court. You have no jurisdiction over me." "Federal crimes fall under federal jurisdiction," Winters replied calmly. "And we have substantial evidence, including sworn statements from witnesses who paid bribes to secure favorable rulings." He nodded to Deputy Hendricks. "Secure the prisoner." "You can't do this," Preston protested as Hendricks approached with handcuffs. "Sheriff Holcomb is also named in the warrant," Winters cut in, "along with several of your business associates." Preston's gaze locked on Willa, hatred burning in his eyes. "This is your doing," he spat. "You and that meddling cowboy." Blake moved protectively closer to Willa, but she stepped forward, meeting Preston's glare steadily. "No, Judge Preston," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "This is your doing. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied." Something in her calm certainty seemed to deflate Preston's bluster. His shoulders sagged as Deputy Hendricks secured the handcuffs around his wrists. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow. As they led Preston from his chambers, a commotion erupted outside the courthouse. Shouts and the sound of running feet filtered through the open doors. Blake immediately moved in front of Willa, his hand going to his holstered revolver. "Sounds like trouble," Winters observed grimly. Deputy Hendricks tightened his grip on Preston. Could be Holcomb returned. They emerged onto the courthouse steps to find a tense standoff in progress. Sheriff Holcomb and his two companions had indeed returned to town, only to find themselves face to face with Deputies Clancy and Taylor, who had evidently tracked and followed them back to Redemption. The two groups faced each other in the middle of the street, weapons drawn but not yet fired. A crowd of townspeople had gathered at a safe distance, watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and fascination. Willa noticed Mrs. Miller among them, her weathered face registering shock at the sight of Judge Preston in handcuffs. "Holcomb." Marshal Winters called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Federal marshals, lower your weapons and surrender peacefully." Sheriff Holcomb turned, his expression darkening further when he saw Preston in custody. "This is none of your concern, Marshal," he shouted back. "This is territorial business." "Not anymore," Winters replied, descending the steps with measured confidence. "I have warrants for you and your associates. Don't make this worse than it already is." A tense silence fell over the scene. Willa held her breath, acutely aware of Blake's solid presence beside her, his body coiled with readiness. This was the moment that could end in bloodshed or surrender. Holcomb's gaze swept from the marshals to the handcuffed judge, then to the gathered townspeople. Something in his expression shifted a calculation, a recognition of changing odds. "Your hired guns won't save you now, Holcomb," Blake called out. "Look around, the whole town is watching. How many innocent people are you willing to risk for Preston's schemes?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Several townsmen stepped forward, some armed with rifles or shotguns. Willa recognized Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, Mrs. Miller's son-in-law, and several farmers from outlying homesteads, solid citizens who had suffered under Preston's corrupt rulings. Holcomb saw it too, the tide of public opinion turning visibly against him. His deputies exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unwilling to die for a lost cause. With a curse, Holcomb lowered his pistol. "This isn't over," he growled. "Yes, Sheriff," Marshal Winters said evenly, "it is." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Deputies Clancy and Taylor took Holcomb and his men into custody, while Winters secured Judge Preston in the town jail, an irony not lost on the townsfolk, who gathered in small groups to discuss the day's extraordinary events. Blake stayed close to Willa throughout, his vigilance undiminished despite the apparent resolution. By late afternoon, Marshal Winters had commandeered the sheriff's office, converting it into a temporary headquarters. The news spread quickly through Redemption and the surrounding area, bringing farmers and ranchers into town to witness the aftermath of Preston's fall. Willa found herself the center of attention, receiving shy thanks from those who had suffered under Preston's corrupt rulings but had been too afraid to speak out. Mrs. Miller embraced her tearfully, whispering, "God bless you for your courage, Miss Thompson." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Redemption's main street, Willa finally found a moment of quiet on the boardwalk outside the hotel. Blake joined her there, leaning against a post, his eyes still watchful despite the relative calm that had settled over the town. "Marshal Winters says they'll transport Preston and Holcomb to Cheyenne tomorrow for formal charges," he informed her. "The federal judge there is known for his integrity. They won't escape justice this time." Willa nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 2 days. "And what happens to Redemption now? The territorial governor will appoint an interim judge and sheriff," Blake explained. "Winters has already sent a telegram with recommendations, good men from what I hear." "And Mrs. Miller's ranch," a smile touched Blake's lips. "First order of business for the new judge will be reviewing Preston's questionable rulings. Winters made sure of that." Relief washed over Willa, followed quickly by a new uncertainty. With Preston and Holcomb removed, the immediate danger had passed, which meant, "What about you?" she asked quietly. "Where do you go from here?" Blake's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Normally, I'd be moving on. Next assignment, next corrupt official to investigate." Willa's heart sank at the words, though she tried not to let it show. Of course he would leave. That was his job, his purpose. The connection she'd felt between them had been born of crisis, perhaps nothing more. "I understand," she said, forcing a smile. "You must be eager to get back to your work." "That's just it," Blake said slowly. "For the first time in years, I'm not eager to move on." He straightened from his casual stance, turning to face her fully. "These past 2 days with you, Willa, they've made me question things I haven't questioned in a long time." Hope fluttered in Willa's chest, but she contained it carefully. "What kind of things?" "The kind of life I want, whether bringing down corrupt men is enough of a purpose." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. Whether there might be room for something more. Willa's breath caught in her throat. "Blake." "I meant what I said, you know," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When I stopped them from whipping you. You said her voice is my freedom," Willa recalled, the words etched in her memory. Blake nodded, a vulnerability in his expression she hadn't seen before. 5 years of moving from town to town, never staying, never connecting. Always hiding who I really am, what I'm really doing. It wears on a man's soul, Willa, makes him forget what he's fighting for." He took her hand gently in his. "Then I heard you in that courtroom, standing up for what's right without fear. Saw you willing to face punishment rather than stay silent." His fingers tightened around hers, and something broke loose inside me, something that had been trapped for a very long time. Willa's heart pounded as she met his intense gaze. "What are you saying, Blake?" "I'm saying I don't want to leave," he admitted. "Not yet, maybe not ever." A hint of uncertainty crossed his face. "Unless you want me to go." For a woman who prided herself on her eloquence, Willa found herself suddenly at a loss for words. Instead, she acted on impulse, stepping forward to close the distance between them. Rising on her tiptoes, she pressed her lips gently to his. Blake froze for an instant, clearly caught by surprise, before his arms came around her, drawing her closer. The kiss deepened, speaking all the words they hadn't yet found. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Willa saw something new in Blake's eyes, hope, perhaps. Or the beginning of happiness. "I don't want you to go," she whispered. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his rugged features. "Then I'll stay, for as long as you'll have me." From the doorway of the hotel, Marshal Winters cleared his throat loudly, causing them to step apart. His stern expression was softened by a knowing twinkle in his eyes. "Lawson," he called, "need to discuss tomorrow's prisoner transport." His gaze shifted to Willa and he tipped his hat respectfully. "Miss Thompson, my apologies for the interruption." No apology needed, Marshal, Willa replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. Blake squeezed her hand once before releasing it. I'll be right there, sir. As Winters disappeared back into the hotel, Blake turned to Willa. Duty calls, but we're not finished with this conversation. I'll hold you to that, Mr. Lawson, she said, a smile playing at her lips. As she watched him follow the Marshal inside, Willa felt a sense of possibility unfurling within her as vast and promising as the western sky above. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she knew with certainty that her life had changed irrevocably the moment Blake Lawson had declared her voice his freedom. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to Redemption. Judge Preston and Sheriff Holcomb were transported to Cheyenne, where they stood trial for corruption and abuse of power. Their convictions sent a clear message throughout the Wyoming territory. Justice would be served, regardless of a man's position or wealth. As Blake had predicted, a new judge reviewed Preston's questionable rulings, restoring Mrs. Miller's ranch and addressing other cases where the former judge had perverted the law for personal gain. The territorial governor appointed an interim sheriff, a former Army captain with a reputation for fairness. Until proper elections could be held through it all, Blake remained in Redemption. He had telegraphed his superiors in Washington, requesting an extended assignment in the area to monitor the transition of authority. Whether his superiors believed this was his only motivation, they granted the request, allowing him to establish a semi-permanent presence in town. At first, Blake took a room at the hotel, but as summer progressed into autumn, he purchased a small cabin on the outskirts of town, spending his free time repairing and expanding it. The townspeople, initially wary of the quiet lawman who had appended their community, gradually came to accept and even respect him. For Willa, the changes were both external and internal. Her standing in the community, briefly tarnished by her outburst in court, was not only restored but elevated. Parents brought their children to her schoolhouse with new respect in their eyes. Several mothers who had previously kept their daughters home, believing education wasted on females, now encouraged them to attend. More profound were the changes in her personal life. Her friendship with Blake deepened day by day, evolving naturally into a courtship that became the subject of well-meaning gossip throughout Redemption. They were often seen riding together on weekends, taking long walks along the creek that bordered the town, or simply sitting on the schoolhouse steps in quiet conversation after Willa's teaching day ended. On a crisp October afternoon, Willa dismissed her students early, watching them scatter into the golden light with shouts of freedom. The maples lining the town's main street had turned crimson and gold, their leaves drifting lazily to the ground with each gust of wind. Blake arrived as the last child disappeared around a corner, leading Samson and another horse, a gentle dappled mare he had recently acquired. "Ready?" he asked, helping Willa mount the mare. "Where are we going?" she questioned, adjusting her skirts over the side saddle. Blake's eyes held a mysterious gleam. "You'll see." They rode out of town, following a trail that wound through pine-covered hills now touched with autumn color. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their path as they climbed steadily higher, eventually emerging onto a rocky promontory that overlooked the entire valley. Redemption was visible in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys as people prepared evening meals. Beyond the town, the landscape stretched to the horizon, rolling hills, distant mountains, and vast open spaces that defined the frontier. Blake helped Willa dismount, then spread a blanket on a flat rock warmed by the afternoon sun. From his saddlebag, he produced a small bundle wrapped in cloth bread, cheese, and 2 apples along with a bottle of wine and 2 tin cups. "A picnic," Willa smiled, settling on the blanket. "Thought you might appreciate the view," Blake replied, sitting beside her. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence, watching the play of light and shadow across the valley as the sun descended toward the western horizon. Willa found herself studying Blake's profile, noting how the constant vigilance that had marked his features when they first met had softened, though not disappeared entirely. Some habits formed by years of danger were not easily broken. I received a letter today, Blake said finally, breaking the companionable silence. Willa felt a flicker of apprehension. From your superiors, he nodded. They've offered me a new assignment, a judge in Montana who might be taking bribes from mining interests. Willa's heart sank, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. This moment had been inevitable, she knew. Blake was a federal deputy marshal, not a small town constable. His work was important, necessary. When do you leave? She asked, her voice carefully steady. Blake turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious. I'm not. What? Willa stared at him in confusion. I'm not taking the assignment, he clarified. I've requested a permanent posting here instead, as a regular marshal, not special deputy, overseeing this region of Wyoming territory. Hope blossomed in Willa's chest, but she contained it carefully. Blake, are you sure? Your work hunting corrupt officials, it matters, it makes a difference. It does, he agreed. And it will continue with or without me. There are other deputies who can take up that mantle. He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. But what I've found here, what I've found with you, that can't be replaced. Willa's breath caught as Blake reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the fading sunlight, a simple gold ring set with a single pearl. It was my mother's, he explained softly. The only thing of hers I kept after she passed. Blake, Willa whispered, her heart racing. Willa Thompson, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. These past months with you have shown me what I've been missing all these years on the trail. A home. A purpose beyond just bringing down the corrupt. He held the ring between them. I'm asking if you'll build that home with me, if you'll be my wife. Tears welled in Willa's eyes, blurring her vision. Are you sure this is what you want? Settling down in one place after so many years of wandering, Blake's expression softened further. The only thing I'm more sure of is that I love you, have since that moment in the courtroom when you stood up for what was right, consequences be damned. His thumb stroked across her knuckles. Your voice gave me freedom, Willa, freedom to imagine a different kind of life, a better one. A tear slipped down Willa's cheek, and your courage gave me freedom too, to be who I truly am without fear. Is that a yes? Blake asked, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Willa laughed through her tears, nodding. Yes, Blake Lawson, yes, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that felt like coming home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sealed their promise with a kiss that spoke of new beginnings and shared tomorrows. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Redemption, met with widespread approval. The schoolteacher and the marshal made a fitting pair. Many observed both principled, both dedicated to serving the community in their own ways. They were married on a bright December morning, snow dusting the ground outside the town's small church. Willa wore a gown of ivory satin, simple but elegant, with Mrs. Miller's borrowed lace veil. Blake, uncharacteristically nervous, stood tall in a new black suit, his badge polished to a shine. Marshal Winters traveled from Cheyenne to stand as Blake's best man, his usually stern countenance softened by genuine pleasure for his former deputy. The church overflowed with townspeople, including all of Willa's students, who presented their teacher with a handmade quilt as a wedding gift. As they exchanged vows, Willa gazed into Blake's eyes and saw the future reflected there, a future neither of them could have imagined when he first rode into Redemption and declared her voice his freedom. A future they would build together, word by word, day by day, as their separate stories became one. Spring 1880 brought gentle renewal to the Wyoming territory. The harsh winter snows melted, revealing tender green shoots reaching toward the strengthening sun. In Redemption, the season of rebirth was especially meaningful for Blake and Willa Lawson, now approaching their second wedding anniversary. Blake stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Willa instructed a group of children gathered in their front yard. Though it was Saturday, these particular students had requested extra lessons not in reading or arithmetic, but in the natural sciences. Willa had eagerly agreed, delighting in their curiosity about the world around them. And these, she was saying, holding up a cluster of tiny blue flowers, are forget-me-nots. They're among the first flowers to bloom after winter. 8-year-old Emma Miller, Mrs. Miller's granddaughter, reached out to touch the delicate blossoms. They're the color of the sky, she observed. That they are, Willa agreed with a smile. Nature has its own palette of colors, each with a purpose. Blake leaned against the porch post, content to observe his wife in her element. Teaching wasn't just Willa's profession, it was her calling. In the 2 years since their marriage, she had expanded the school curriculum, introduced a lending library, and even started evening classes for adults in the community who wished to improve their reading skills. Redemption itself had changed as well. With Preston's corruption removed, legitimate businesses flourished. The new judge permanently appointed after the interim period was a thoughtful, fair-minded man who applied the law equally to all. Blake's position as territorial marshal kept him busy, but allowed him to make their cabin his home base, a compromise that satisfied both his sense of duty and his desire for rootedness. As the lesson concluded and the children dispersed with promises to bring their discoveries to Monday's class, Willa approached the porch, her cheeks flushed with enthusiasm and the spring air. "You've created quite the band of naturalists," Blake observed, helping her up the steps. "They're wonderful, aren't they? So eager to learn, to understand." Willa's eyes sparkled. "Emma has a real gift for observation. She noticed patterns in the wildflowers that I hadn't even pointed out." Blake tucked a strand of copper hair behind Willa's ear. "Like teacher, like student." Willa smiled, leaning into his touch. At 30, she had lost none of the passion that had first drawn him to her. If anything, the security of their life together had allowed her to bloom more fully, her natural curiosity and independence finding fertile ground in their partnership. "I received a letter from Marshal Winters today," Blake said as they entered the cabin. Willa looked up with interest. "Good news, I hope. Judge Preston died in prison last week." Blake's tone was neutral. Pneumonia, apparently. Willa was quiet for a moment, absorbing the news. "I can't say I'm sorry," she finally admitted, "but I don't rejoice in any man's death either." "That's why I love you," Blake said simply. "Your sense of justice is tempered with humanity." He moved to the fireplace, stoking the embers to life against the spring evening's chill. The cabin had grown with their needs: a larger kitchen, a proper study where Willa prepared her lessons, a spare bedroom that currently held books but someday, perhaps. Blake had been thinking about that possibility more frequently of late. They hadn't rushed into parenthood, both enjoying the freedom to establish their life together without immediate additions. But lately, watching Willa with her students, he'd found himself wondering what their children might be like: curious and principled like their mother, he hoped. "You're deep in thought," Willa observed, placing a hand on his shoulder. Blake covered her hand with his. "Just thinking about the future. Anything specific?" There was a note in her voice that made him turn to look at her more closely. Willa's expression held something new: a secret knowledge, a barely contained joy. "Willa," he questioned, suddenly alert to the subtle change. She took his hand and placed it gently against her abdomen, still flat beneath her simple dress. "I've suspected for a few weeks," she said softly. "But now I'm certain. By winter there will be 3 of us in this cabin." For a moment, Blake couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions: joy, wonder, and a fierce protectiveness that took his breath away. Then he gathered Willa in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of exuberance. "Careful," she laughed, even as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "A baby," he marveled, setting her gently down but keeping her close. "Our baby." Willa nodded, her eyes bright with happy tears. "A new voice to add to our chorus." Blake kissed her then, pouring all his love and wonder into the gesture. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, overcome with gratitude for the life they had built together. "When I rode into redemption that day," he murmured, "I never imagined this. You, us, a family. No." Willa smiled. "Even when you declared my voice your freedom, I meant it," Blake admitted. "But I didn't understand then all that it would come to mean." Outside their window, the Wyoming sky deepened toward evening, stars beginning to appear in the vast expanse. Within their home, the fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed their love grow from tentative beginnings to this moment of perfect certainty. "Your voice is still my freedom," Blake whispered against Willa's hair. "And now it will guide our child as well." Willa's arms tightened around him. "Our voices together," she corrected gently. "That's the real freedom, not just mine, not just yours. The courage to speak truth, to stand for justice, to love without reservation, that's what we'll teach our child." Blake nodded, his heart full beyond measure. From that fateful day when they had faced down corruption together to this moment of quiet joy, their journey had been one of shared purpose and deepening love. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced all others side by side, their voices united in defense of what was right and true. As twilight settled over the Wyoming territory, Blake Lawson held his wife close, marveling at the unexpected gift his life had become. Once a solitary rider pursuing justice across the frontier, he had found in Willa Thompson not only a partner, but a home, a place where freedom and love were one and the same. Outside their window, the first stars of evening appeared, silent witnesses to the continuing story of the schoolteacher who dared to speak truth to power, and the lawman who declared her voice his freedom. Their story, which had begun in danger and defiance, now unfolded in peace and promise, a testament to the enduring power of courage, justice, and love in the wild heart of the American West. On a crisp autumn morning 5 years later, Willa Lawson stood before her classroom, watching her students file in for the day's lessons. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see the maples along Redemption's Main Street, ablaze with color, a vibrant backdrop to the town's steady growth and prosperity. At the back of the classroom, 4-year-old Sarah Lawson carefully hung her coat on a peg, her copper hair so like her mother's catching the morning light. Though not yet of official school age, Sarah attended most mornings, absorbing knowledge like a sponge and charming even the oldest students with her earnest questions. "Good morning, everyone," Willa greeted as the children settled into their seats. "Before we begin our arithmetic lesson, I have some exciting news to share." 20 expectant faces turned toward her, from 6-year-old Tommy Jenkins, new to school this year, to 16-year-old Margaret Wilson, preparing for her final term before heading east to a women's college in Boston. "Next week," Willa continued, "we'll have a special visitor. Mr. Thomas Edison has invented something called a phonograph that can record and play back the human voice. Marshal Lawson has arranged for a demonstration here in Redemption." Excited murmurs rippled through the classroom. Even in this remote corner of Wyoming territory, news of Edison's inventions had spread, capturing imaginations with promises of electric lights and mechanical wonders. Sarah's eyes widened, pride evident in her small face at the mention of her father's role in this marvel. "Will Papa bring the machine to school?" she asked. "He will indeed," Willa confirmed with a smile. "Now let's turn to page 17 in our arithmetic books." As the morning progressed, Willa moved between desks, offering guidance and encouragement. The school had grown substantially under her direction, now boasting 2 classrooms and an assistant teacher, Miss Rebecca Collins, a recent graduate from an Eastern teaching college who handled the younger children while Willa focused on the advanced students. Shortly before the midday break, the schoolhouse door opened, admitting a blast of cool air and Blake Lawson, still cutting an impressive figure in his Marshal's coat and hat. At 38, his face showed more lines than when they'd first met, and silver threads now appeared at his temples, but his eyes remained as keen and clear as ever. "Marshal," Willa acknowledged formally, though her eyes conveyed a more personal greeting. "What brings you to our classroom today?" "Official business, Mrs. Lawson," he replied with equal formality, though a smile lurked at the corners of his mouth. "Need to borrow my deputy for an important mission." Sarah straightened importantly. Blake had taken to calling her his deputy from the time she could walk, delighting in her serious attempts to help him with simple tasks around their home. "What kind of mission, Papa?" she asked, already slipping from her seat. "The kind involving apple picking at Widow Miller's orchard," Blake said solemnly. "She's offering 2 cents per pound, and I hear the Red Delicious are at their peak." Excited whispers passed among the students. Mrs. Miller's apple orchard, established after her ranch was restored following Judge Preston's removal, had become a local institution. Each autumn, she hired local children to help with the harvest, paying fair wages and providing hot cider as they worked. "May I dismiss everyone early for the day?" Willa asked, looking around at the now fidgeting students. "I believe practical economics might be more instructive than our planned geography lesson." Cheers erupted at Blake's nod of agreement. Within minutes, the classroom emptied, students racing home to get permission and baskets for the impromptu apple-picking expedition. Blake had organized similar community activities regularly over the years, believing that bringing people together for honest work and fair pay built stronger bonds than any law enforcement strategy. As the last student departed, Blake crossed the room to where Willa stood beside her desk. "Hello, wife," he said softly, dropping the formal pretense. "Hello, husband," she returned, accepting his quick kiss. "This is a pleasant surprise." Sarah tugged at Blake's coat. "Can we go now, Papa? I want to pick the biggest apples." "In a moment, Deputy." Blake crouched down to her level. "Why don't you run over to Miss Collins's classroom and see if she'd like to join us? Tell her we're forming an apple-picking posse." With a serious nod, Sarah darted out, leaving her parents momentarily alone. "How are you feeling?" Blake asked, his hand moving instinctively to rest on Willa's slightly rounded abdomen. "Much better today," she assured him. "The morning sickness seems to be easing finally." This pregnancy, their second, had been more difficult than the first, with persistent nausea that had sometimes left Willa too ill to teach. Now in her 4th month, she was finally regaining her energy and appetite. "You're sure you're up for apple picking?" Blake's concern was evident in his eyes. Willa covered his hand with hers. "Fresh air will do me good. Besides, I wouldn't miss seeing our daughter in her element. She's been talking about Mrs. Miller's apples for weeks." Blake's expression softened. "She has your determination." "And your sense of justice," Willa added. "Yesterday she made Tommy Jenkins apologize for taking Lucy Perkins's slate pencil, said it wasn't fair that boys think they can take things from girls." Pride flickered in Blake's eyes. Wonder where she got that notion. "Certainly not from her mother, who once stood up to a corrupt judge and nearly got whipped for her trouble," Willa replied with mock innocence. Blake laughed, then sobered slightly. "Never regretted it, have you, speaking out that day?" Willa tilted her head, considering. "Not the speaking out." "Perhaps the lack of strategy," she smiled. "I've learned a few things about picking my battles and my methods since then." "We both have," Blake acknowledged. In the years since Judge Preston's removal, they had worked together in different ways to improve their community. Blake through his position as Marshal, ensuring fair application of the law. Willa through education and quiet advocacy for those without voices of their own. Sarah's return with Miss Collins in tow ended their private moment. The young teacher, still somewhat in awe of the Marshal despite 2 years in redemption, blushed slightly at his greeting. "Ready for our apple-picking expedition?" Blake asked, settling his hat back on his head. "Yes, sir," Miss Collins replied, "though I confess I've never picked apples before. We didn't have orchards where I grew up in Pennsylvania." "Sarah will show you how," Willa assured her. "She's becoming quite the expert." They left the schoolhouse together, joining the stream of excited children and parents already heading toward Mrs. Miller's orchard on the outskirts of town. As they walked, Willa slipped her arm through Blake's, contentment warming her despite the autumn chill. "You're looking mighty pleased with yourself, Marshal Lawson," she observed. Blake glanced down at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just counting my blessings, Mrs. Lawson." Ahead of them, Sarah skipped along, her red hair bouncing with each step. Around them, the town of Redemption, once a place of fear and corruption, thrived under fair governance and community spirit. And between them, invisible but undeniably present, was the new life growing beneath Willa's heart, another voice to join their chorus of freedom and love. "So am I," Willa said softly. So am I. The apple-picking expedition proved to be exactly what Willa needed: fresh air, physical activity, and the joy of watching Sarah industriously filling her small basket under Blake's patient guidance. Mrs. Miller, now in her 70s but still spry, moved among the pickers, offering encouragement and occasional advice on selecting the ripest fruit. "That husband of yours has been good for this town," Mrs. Miller remarked, pausing beside Willa. "For you too, I'd say." Willa smiled, watching as Blake lifted Sarah onto his shoulders to reach a particularly perfect apple. "We've been good for each other," she replied. Mrs. Miller nodded sagely. "That's the secret, isn't it? Finding someone who makes you more yourself, not less." She patted Willa's arm. "Come by the house before you leave. I've put up some ginger preserves that might help with your condition." Willa laughed softly. "Is there anything you don't notice, Mrs. Miller, at my age? Very little." The older woman winked before moving on to help one of the younger children who was struggling with a heavy basket. By late afternoon, the orchard buzzed with productive activity. Nearly 40 people, adults and children alike, worked among the trees, filling baskets and wagons with ripe apples destined for market, winter storage, or Mrs. Miller's kitchen, where they would be transformed into pies, preserves, and cider. Blake organized the older boys into teams to load the heaviest baskets onto wagons, turning what could have been drudgery into a good-natured competition. Willa noticed how he managed to include even the shyest children, finding tasks that matched their abilities and boosting their confidence with well-timed praise. "Your Marshal certainly has a way with children," Miss Collins observed, coming to stand beside Willa. "Sarah adores him." "He understands them," Willa replied, "respects them as people, not just as small adults in training." The younger teacher nodded thoughtfully. "That's rare in a man, especially one in a position of authority." Willa's gaze lingered on her husband, remembering the solitary, guarded man she had first met. "Blake learned early that authority without compassion becomes tyranny," she said. "It's shaped everything he does." As the sun began to set, Mrs. Miller called everyone to the long tables set up near her house, where steaming mugs of spiced cider and plates of fresh donuts awaited. The workers gathered eagerly, cheeks flushed from exertion and the crisp air, comparing their day's earnings and the size of their harvests. Sarah found her parents among the crowd, proudly holding up her small bag of coins. "Look, Mama, I earned 38 cents. Can I save it for a book?" "A fine idea," Willa approved, brushing leaves from her daughter's hair. "Perhaps we can order it from the catalog next time Mr. Peterson travels to Cheyenne." Sarah beamed, carefully tucking the coins into the pocket of her pinafore. Her expression suddenly turned serious. "Papa said the baby might come in February. Will it like books too?" Willa exchanged an amused glance with Blake. "I imagine so, with you as a big sister to teach it." Satisfied with this answer, Sarah darted off to join her friends at one of the children's tables, her energy apparently inexhaustible despite the long day of work. "Sometimes I wonder which of us she takes after," Blake mused, watching her go. "Both, I think," Willa replied. "Your sense of duty, my love of learning." "And both our stubbornness," Blake added with a chuckle. They joined the adults at the main table, where conversation flowed as freely as Mrs. Miller's cider. The talk turned, as it often did, to changes coming to the territory, the railroad's planned expansion, rumors of statehood, new inventions like Edison's that promised to transform daily life even on the frontier. "Progress is all well and good," Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, declared, "but I don't see how any machine could replace good horseshoes made by hand." "They said the same about spinning wheels," his wife reminded him, "yet you don't see me carding wool by hand anymore." The good-natured debate continued as darkness fell and lanterns were lit around the tables. Blake's hand found Willa's beneath the table, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm, a private gesture of affection amid the community gathering. Later, as they walked home through the starlit evening, Sarah drowsy in Blake's arms and their basket heavy with choice apples, Willa felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they had built. The road hadn't always been easy. Blake's duties sometimes took him away for days or weeks. her teaching responsibilities grew more demanding as the school expanded. There had been illnesses, disagreements, the normal challenges of any marriage. But through it all, they had remained true to the principles that had first brought them together: justice, courage, and the unshakable belief in each other's fundamental worth. What had begun as a desperate act of intervention, Blake stepping between Willa, and an unjust punishment had blossomed into a partnership that strengthened them both. At home, Blake carried a now sleeping Sarah to her small bedroom while Willa lit lamps and stoked the fire against the autumn chill. Their cabin had expanded over the years: a proper living room with bookshelves lining one wall, a kitchen with a modern stove, a study where Blake kept his Marshal's records and Willa prepared her lessons. When Blake returned from tucking Sarah in, he found Willa standing by the living room window, gazing out at the night sky. Coming up behind her, he wrapped his arms around her, his hands resting gently on her growing abdomen. "Penny, for your thoughts," he murmured against her hair. Willa leaned back into his embrace. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, not just us, but redemption itself." Blake nodded, following her gaze to where the town's lights glimmered in the distance. "It's become what its name promised, a place of second chances for all of us." Willa turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever miss it? The freedom of the trail, going wherever duty called you?" Blake considered the question seriously as he did all of Willa's inquiries. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he admitted. "Right and wrong seemed clearer then. But I've never once regretted choosing this life with you. Even with a spirited daughter who questions everything and another child on the way," Willa teased gently. Blake's hand cradled her cheek. "Especially then, you and Sarah and this little one, you're the best kind of freedom." His voice deepened with emotion. "The freedom to love without reservation, to build something that matters." Willa rose on tiptoes to kiss him, still moved by the eloquence that emerged when he spoke from the heart. For a man of relatively few words, Blake Lawson had a poet's soul when it came to expressing what truly mattered to him. "Speaking of building," she said when they parted, "Sarah asked me today if the baby will have its own room." Blake smiled. "I've been thinking about that. The storage space off the kitchen could be converted. It gets good morning light." "Always planning ahead, Marshal Lawson." Willa's tone was affectionate. "Learned that from my schoolteacher wife," he returned. "Always prepared for any contingency." They moved together toward their bedroom, the day's physical activity beginning to take its toll on them both. As they prepared for bed, their movements held the comfortable synchronicity of a couple long accustomed to sharing space and lives. "Blake," Willa said softly as they settled beneath the quilts. He was already half asleep, arm draped protectively across her middle. "I felt the baby move today while we were picking apples." Blake's eyes opened fully. "Really?" Willa nodded, "just a flutter like butterfly wings." His hand spread across her abdomen as if hoping to catch another movement. "Boy or girl, what do you think?" "I'm not sure it matters," Willa replied truthfully. "As long as it has your heart and a voice of its own." Blake pulled her closer. "And your courage," he added. "Don't forget that." As sleep claimed them both, Willa's last conscious thought was of that day in Redemption's dusty street, when a stranger had declared her voice his freedom. How could either of them have known then where that moment would lead? To a home filled with books and laughter, to a daughter with curious eyes and a questioning mind, to another child growing beneath her heart, to a community transformed by justice and shared purpose. Some would call it destiny. Willa preferred to think of it as the natural consequence of courage, the courage to speak truth, to stand against injustice, to love completely. Whatever name it bore, she was profoundly grateful for the life that had emerged from that single defining moment when Blake Lawson had chosen to stand beside her, forever changing both their stories. Outside their window, stars wheeled slowly across the Wyoming sky, silent witnesses to the continuing journey of two people who had found in each other not constraints, but the truest form of freedom, the freedom to become their best selves together.